Greetings, Corpse Clubbers, and welcome to a brand new episode of Corpse Club, the official podcast for DailyDead.com. My name is Heather Wixson, and if you've been paying attention this month over at Daily Dead, we have been celebrating Gialloween every day for the last week or so. And so we thought we would carry that over into our Corpse Club episodes this month. And for this week's episode, we're going to be diving into what I call neo-giallo with a NU because I'm fancy. And we're going to be talking about The Editor and Knife and Heart. And for this week, I am joined by Bryan Christopher, as well as Monte Yazzie, who I did not realize the last time we talked was your first ever Corpse Club appearance. So my apologies, Monte, for missing that milestone the first time around.
That's okay. I'm really happy back today. Love the first time this opportunity, and I'm super glad that I can come back to talk about one of my favorite genres, the giallo.
Yes, and Bryan and I are here to make sure we disappoint you the second time, though. So,
I will say I'm super excited because we're kind of forming this de facto, like whenever Daily Dead has like a special campaign. So I guess it was the class of 80 and now it's the Gialloween. Like we seem to come together, like not necessarily planned, but like this trio, I think it's going to be like whenever we have special stuff come up, we're going to come together and do an episode. We're
like the special super friends.
Yes.
Of Corpse Club. I like it. Yes, for those listening, we last time the three of us got together and chatted for Corpse Club, it was for Altered States, which was a lot of fun. And this one I was really excited for because I hadn't had a chance to watch The Editor prior to this episode, and I had not watched Knife and Heart, even though it had been on my to watch list for a while now. So this gave me the perfect opportunity. I think that's what I'm loving so much about doing Gialloween this year. Is that one, we're all kind of working outside of our comfort zones a little bit for a lot of us, unless you're Patrick, and maybe Scott, because Scott's 100 years old. Love you, Scott. So he's had, most of these have existed since he was a kid. But I think what's great for this is it's been a real education for me. And I think what's fascinating is last week's episode, I got to talk about sort of classic giallo movies. And this week we're talking about sort of new stuff because, giallos kind of fell out of fashion for a while. But it's kind of cool that we've had these directors who've come back and sort of reinterpreted, this subgenre in some new and very different ways.
I'm also particularly looking forward to these two because I feel like I need to give a disclosure up front. I am usually at best lukewarm on giallos. And I think we'll probably get into some of the details in terms of why these movies work for me, The Editor and Knife and Heart, where some of the classics sometimes don't. So take whatever I'm saying tonight with a grain of salt in terms of, I don't know how much credibility I'll have just going into it saying I'm not a huge giallo fan, but I think it's going to kind of help paint my perspective on these. So it's probably an important note to make.
Yeah, I think it's interesting too, because, in terms of the first movie, we're going to talk about The Editor. Obviously you have, it's very much, its intentions are very different than Knife and Heart, where The Editor is sort of, in a way, it's a celebration, but it's also a send up of giallo movies. Although I would argue that a lot of this movie also tips its hat to the beyond in a variety of ways. So it almost feels like it's more broad in its scope in terms of just embracing Italian cinema. It's particularly Fulci stuff. But yeah, it was one of those, I have the Blu-ray. I've been meaning to watch it for years. I just never got around to it. And I was mostly pleased with it. It feels a little long, but I think overall, what works about it really works well.
Well, it's going for a giallo feel, so it has to be a little long.
That's true. Although most of the ones I've been watching are 90 minutes. I know this is 90 minutes or 95 minutes, but I don't know. There's 10 minutes in this movie that I feel like could have gone by the way, to the side. And I don't know that I would have missed them.
I can see that.
Yeah. So Monte, for you, because you're a big giallo fan, are you team pro editor or are you team con editor? How does The Editor land for you?
So Editor has always been this film that I I dissect over and over and over again. As the first time I watched it, I had a really negative response to it because I felt like it was making fun of giallo films. So there was a lot of me on that first viewing where I was sitting there thinking to myself, I'm like, it feels like almost, it feels like they're spoofing this genre that I really have a lot of affection for. But I watched it now, like I think this last week was my fourth time watching it, and I've slowly moved into this more appreciative position on the film, because I think even though it feels to me like they're spoofing some elements, they are really spoofing it in a very, very specific and long way. And those spoofs they're getting, that they're trying to emulate, are being with technique. And there's a part of it that I really love. I know that, the filmmakers probably didn't go in thinking that they were going to spoof it, but at the same time, when I watch it, I think to myself that it just does a great job of like really touching on everything that defines a giallo, and that characteristic can be so complex and so varied. They seem to nail it pretty well on exactly like the different elements define what a giallo film should be.
Yeah, when I was watching the editor, I kept thinking like this is almost like this is to a giallo what like Spaceballs is to Star Wars, and it's a send up, and they're clearly having fun with the giallo tropes, but it's also done by people who have clearly done their homework, and they're done their homework to the point where they have to be fans, because to be this kind of intimately aware of the different stuff that goes on in a giallo movie, they need to, like, they've clearly watched a lot of them. So it's, for me, it was all in good fun. Like, it wasn't anything where they were looking down on the giallo. It was kind of, they were laughing with the tropes and not at the tropes.
And I mean, and if you're thinking about giallo movies in general, I mean, like, and I say this lovingly, but like, they're often pretty ridiculous with some of the directions that they go into. It's like, I just, for last week's episode, like, one of the movies has an orangutan living in a castle. Like, okay, sure. Why not? Why not, everybody? And the orangutan has like an elaborate backstory, even better. And that's what I love about giallo movies, is that, like, one, you never know what you're going to get. And two, it's like, if you want a movie that is going to pack in as much plot and in like all this kind of structure and things into these 90 something minutes, like, you can't go wrong then, because you're going to get so much thrown at you in these movies. And I think the editor, like, it really, it's everywhere. Like, this movie, there's just like twists and turns and characters. And it's just like, at a certain point, like, I actually paused for a second because I was taking notes the whole time. I was like, wait, okay, so this person is married to this person, but this person likes this person. Like, it was just one of those where I was like, I had to start connecting the dots on paper just so I could keep it all straight, because there's like 15 characters in this movie, they all matter, which is, they all have these like stories and these connections, and it's just, they can be a lot. And I get why some people don't like giallo movies, but I think that's what I love about them. Like, I love a good, straightforward, stripped down narrative, but I also like really crazy, dense narratives as well. And I think, that's one of the things that the editor gets right, is that, like, they're like, let's just throw everything and the kitchen sink and, I don't know, maybe like a whole community's worth of like stuff at you, and like, let's just see what works. And I think for the most part, it mostly works. And I think, there's a lot of really good stuff that goes on in here.
And I think that's, I definitely agree, Heather. You had mentioned earlier that they incorporate some other Italian cinema tropes in there. There's definitely some Fulci imprints. Like, if nothing else, the actress that gets the hysterical blindness and, like, the milky eyes going over, like, that's straight out of, I forget if it's either Gates of Hell or Beyond. Yeah. There's stuff in there that's definitely, for as bonkers as giallo is, like, for total insanity, you can't beat Fulci, and they definitely play into some of that fun in this one as well.
Well, and I think that's too where the film really succeeds, is in the fact that it's really paying homage to some of the great giallos that have come before it, And you can feel the influence from Argento. You can feel the influence from, Martino. You can feel the influence from Fulci. You can feel all these different pieces kind of working together. And when the film's trying to be serious, you can see it evoking Argento. When it's trying to be silly, you can evoking Fulci. And I think it just really works really well together. It is tough still for me to look at this film because, there's so much of it that is happening. And Heather, you explained it really great that, they packed so much into the narrative concept for this film that, you do almost have to keep notes to figure out where everything's going. But then, like, you go back to the creation, the giallo concept, and, it's birthed from detective stories and procedurals and crime sagas, and in novellas, many of these twists and turns were incorporated as part of the story. Like you were meant to have that many twists and turns. So the fact that giallo kind of incorporate too, and that the editor gets right in so many different ways, is really an accomplishment, I think, and really exactly what Bryan said. They are kind of poking fun at the genre, but also at the same time, lovingly so, because you don't think that is so defined like the editor having some kind of love for genres in the beginning.
Yeah, and I think also too, what's really great, and I say this as somebody who is, with somebody who edits film for a living, is that it is sort of this homage to the unsung hero of film, which is the editor of a movie. I think a lot of times that's sort of a aspect of filmmaking that often gets overlooked, despite how critical it is to the success of whether or not a movie works or not. And I just love the fact that, like, they could have picked any sort of part of a filmmaking crew. Like, I mean, I don't know if you would watch a movie called The Grip. No offense to any grips out there, but but it's one of those where, like, I just love that they sort of nod to the old days and when you would actually have to cut a movie. Mm-hmm. And then I also like how that parlays into the backstory of Ray, the editor in the movie, in sort of a weird and hilarious way. But then ultimately ties into the killer of the movie, and sort of the trophies that they take. I mean, it's just, again, it's one of those things where it's silly and sometimes obvious, but yet it's a real clever way that they sort of approach a lot of these things that, like, I was like, okay, these guys know what they're doing. And I mean, I like the Astron 6 guys, but I will say, like, having an editor in a day and age where you have to, like, actually cut the film and piece it together, but he has wooden fingers because he previously cut his fingers off in a tizzy of editing and manicness. I think it's just, like, it's really smart and clever. And, I think in a lot of ways, like, I just like that it also sort of, gives us something to enjoy about the good old days of making movies, because I'm old.
And I do also think, like, it's awesome that they chose kind of the focus for the editor. And then it also seems like a very deliberate decision, because the editor is usually the person who, like, you're most questioning in most of Italian cinema. Like, when there's like, yeah, when there's these scenes that just go off in these tangents, it's like, why didn't anybody cut that out? And that's kind of what they're doing here. There's stuff that, like, there's these narrative threads that just don't go anywhere, but that's part of the point. Like, or they are leading you in this one direction, and then, like, you think there's going to be a resolution and there's not necessarily one. So it's just that idea of, like, we're going to highlight the person that usually, if you have questions about the narrative in a giallo, it's usually asking the editor, like, why did they make that decision? So getting into the mind of the editor in this movie, I think, is a very deliberate choice.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think also too, it's, if you think about it, like, there's also sort of the tongue in cheek aspect of it, of, when you talk about, like, things being left on the cutting room floor. Mm-hmm. And I think it's a really smart way of sort of because a lot of giallo movies, and and I'm saying this as somebody who's still very much a newbie, so I don't like to speak in absolutisms or anything like that. But so many times in these movies, there's always like one person who's set up as the obvious choice, and it's never them in the end. But there's this one part. There's always like this one character in the movie where you're just kind of always like on them, and they always seem to have the biggest cloud of suspicion around them.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just interesting that like he's sort of this guy who ultimately, at least within the framework of this story, like can make or break somebody because like he'll cut characters completely out if he wants. So in a way, it's like almost sort of, it works in two different ways in terms of like, the actual kills of the movie or like the body count of the movie versus the work that he's doing in the movie and what he like ultimately can kill off in that, in that part of it as well.
Mm-hmm.
And hopefully that makes sense. Oh, did we lose Monte?
I'm still here.
Oh,
sorry.
okay. Gotcha.
Yep. I was just taking in everything that you said right there. There is a lot going on there, that is worthy of like, taking account to it. And I oftentimes tell people that, the giallo film is really trying, at least in the artistic sense, is trying to convey a bunch of different emotions and a bunch of different feelings through the use of like color, the use of like character development, and even through its complications in the narrative that they build. So, for times these giallo will grow bigger and bigger, more complex, more complicated, more confusing as they move on. But at the core, they're always trying to get a hold of something. And I think, the selection tonight between theater and Knife Plus Heart, there is that balance both of these films are trying to go for. And, you can see a difference in the fact that, the editor really is a thematic approach to telling a story versus where Knife and Heart is really taking that quality of the giallo, incorporating the story. And I think that the two films really balance each other out really nice. And you're thinking about like a double feature and wanting to get into new giallo films, that this would be the perfect double feature for that, because you are getting kind of ends of the spectrum. One that is a spectacle, one that is using that spectacle to kind of tell a different kind of story.
Yeah, I didn't realize the through lines that would sort of happen with these movies, because I was just kind of looking for sort of new examples of giallo movies, and these were sort of the two that was like immediately came to my mind. I was like, okay, well, there we go, double feature set. And then as I was watching it and realizing how crucial a film editor, I mean, they're both movies about making movies, which is something I love. If a movie is about the movie making process, I'm already like 3 stars in. So you just have to work a little bit harder after that just for me to like it. So I didn't even realize that like I was sort of unintentionally putting these two movies together that ended up being very similar, but totally different approaches to it. And then ultimately both of them, the editor is super crucial to the narrative of each movie in very, very different ways. But I'd like to say that it was sort of a genius move on my part, but it was totally accidental. But I'm glad it worked out that way, because it was a very interesting sort of back-to-back viewing for me between these two movies.
And I think the reason that both of these movies have kind of stuck around on kind of the cinematic radar is because it was two people who acknowledged, or two directors that acknowledged, it's very hard to just make a straightforward giallo at this point, because like everything under the sun, like everything's been done under the sun at this point when it comes to giallo. And like every crazy thing you could do as a straightforward giallo has been done. So you can either do like a loving parody, or you can do something of a loving homage. And I think that's kind of what you're getting out of these two movies. And with the editor, it's the loving parody. They're exploring the tropes, and just pulling the humor out of them while still making a good movie. And I think what we're going to talk about more when we get to Knife and Heart is taking the tropes of a giallo and digging deeper to tell a different kind of story than what a normal giallo would tell.
Absolutely. And I also love, at the beginning when they're filming the scenes of Tarantola. Hopefully I'm saying that right. I took French, not Italian. But I love the fact that it sort of opens with an homage to Tenebra, which I had a discussion also too. Is it Tenebra, Tenebrae? I think we've come to the decision that both are equally right. But I love that it sort of opens like that. For me, immediately set the tone. I was like, oh, well, you're clearly doing some Tenebra here. Let's keep going. And, of course you get a lot of different things in here in terms of like a little bit with Bird with the Crystal Plumage. And I haven't seen it yet, but I know, I believe there's some torso in here as well. And I do know there's a little bit of deep red as well. And there's another one that was mentioned in an article I was reading. I was reading a review, and they also mentioned Lizard in a Woman's Skin, which I'll be watching in the next few weeks myself. And I just love that they sort of open that up. Like, it would be obvious to sort of do the more, I don't want to say like mainstream giallo movies, because I don't think that actually exists. But, there's clearly, when you're a genre fan, like, they're the movies that like people talk about. So when you talk about giallo movies, like there's sort of this like, there's a handful of them that always come up in the conversation. And I like that for this, it's not always the most obvious. Even if Tenebra is the one part that sort of threw me into it. I like that it digs a little bit deeper. And then, as we mentioned, it also goes into the beyond quite a bit between the character with the milky eyes and her seeing eye dog, which is literally almost like the same type, like it's a German Shepherd, just like in the Beyond. And I think even the tarantula scene in the library is very similar to the tarantula scene in the Beyond. I was trying to think, I actually had a bunch of Beyond notes in here, and I was like, wow. So we're opening it all up. But again, I think it works. I don't think it really sort of detracts from the intentions of the movie by kind of, how do you not tip your hat to Fulci when you're doing something like this and going beyond just his sort of gialli output?
I did notice that I think they even snuck a little Bava in there in terms of Twitch of the Death Nerve / Bay of Blood, just with the whole idea of like, turns out there's at least like 2 killers in this just randomly. Cause like there's who we, and I assume we're okay doing spoilers on this, right?
Yeah. People have had like, 5 years.
Yeah. I actually needed to stall for a second too, because with everything going on, I actually needed to remember who the actual like main killer was. Turns out to be Cizo's wife, played by Paz de la Huerta, I believe.
Yes.
But you also find out, like almost as like a jokey aside, that one of the people was killed by what's his name, Cal, just because he wanted to be the star of the movie. And just some hints at like kind of everybody's kind of the villain, which was because even though he's not one of the killers, I think Porphyry is like, he's kind of that classic inspector from the giallo, where it's also like, in any other movie, you'd probably be the bad guy. He inadvertently kills his wife and then like, tries to cover it up so it doesn't seem like he did it. He's just kind of an a-hole the whole time. I love the scene where Cizo and his wife are in the restaurant talking, and she's just like giving him a hard time. And the detective literally just comes in to like slap her around a little bit.
Yes.
And to tell him like, hey man, I can't be here to do this for you every time. Like you got to keep her in line. And then like afterwards, she's like, yeah, I was getting really out of line. Where were you on that one, man? It's just so ridiculous. And just kind of like, really sending up kind of some of that, probably not as intentional in actual giallos, misogyny that comes up quite often.
Yeah, there's a lot of woman slapping in gialli movies.
Yes.
I actually, I've been watching it, like, especially because I watched The Editor like a couple days ago, and I've watched it like 5 movies since that have sort of been in this, and I'm like, oh wow, they really nailed some of this stuff.
I noticed that too. Yeah, I had to watch like the movie that I'm covering for Gialloween this year. I watched that after the editor. And I'm like, oh man, they didn't need to take it too far, like in terms of like, it seems like they're going very over the top in the editor, and it's like, they didn't really have to amp it up too much beyond what actually happens in some of these.
Well, in most giallos as well too, like the men are the most grotesque and disgusting people.
Mm-hmm.
You know, even your hero, if he's a man, is still like extremely flawed. Many times you'll also slapping a female in the movie, and you're still meant to kind of follow this man as he's solving the case. And you know, I think that's what the editor gets really well. And I love the opening minutes of the editor as well too. The fact that, you know, they're really playing with all those giallo elements. You know, men can't just lust at women; they have to lust and be extremely sweaty while they're doing it. Women can't just be nude on stage; they have to be nude and do special, you know, acts while they're on stage as well too. And there's just so much in the first like 5 minutes of that movie that if you're a giallo fan, you'll immediately say like, oh, these are all giallo tropes, but at this time they're also being amped up as much as possible to make you feel the fact that, you know, they are a small degree poking fun at those elements and everything. And, you know, I think, you know, over time, that's where the editor has fallen for me is as to something that is really more fun than to be at all serious. And, you know, as a giallo purist and somebody who loves the giallo films, it took me a while to get to that point. You know, I remember the first viewing just being so kind of sad at the fact that we're making fun of something that I like so much.
Yeah, I've had to learn how to sort of, saying this politely, get the stick out of my butt when it comes to parody sometimes, because I remember, I don't even remember what it was, but I remember seeing something and I was so deeply offended. I was like, how dare you? It was like somebody had like come along and like beat up my grandmother or something like that. And then it was like, God, I'm trying to remember. Shoot. It was at a festival and everybody else is like laughing and stuff. And I'm just looking around like, I'm like, what are you guys laughing at? And then I remember watching it a second time, you know, and I think also mood can also affect these things. And I was like, oh, that was really fun. That wasn't doing what I thought it was doing. And I just realized like, it's okay to poke fun at things you like. And I've gotten a little bit more of a sense of humor about these things. Cause you know, maybe sometimes I take my job a little too seriously. And I like that movies like The Editor come along to sort of remind you that it's, you know, it's cool to have some fun with these things that you love because it's just film. It's not like, you know, it's not so serious. And there's room to sort of, you know, take these things and like be a little playful with them and, you know, and talk about some of the ridiculous things. Because again, when you talk about some certain genre movies and twists and turns and reveals and orangutans and windows and things like that, like, they kind of are ridiculous at times, but that's what makes them so great and makes them so memorable. And that's why for a lot of these movies that have been out for like almost 60 years, you know, some of them have been out for like 50 years, almost 50 years now. Like that's why we're still talking about them because they are what they are. And maybe if they had played it safe and maybe if they hadn't, you know, really just packed in all the craziness that they do into these movies, like maybe we wouldn't, you know, maybe they would have just kind of came and went, and then that was it.
And I do think there's always that element of like, I think especially as horror fans, we get very defensive about our genre just because there are so many people who look down on it as a whole. So we're so used to like, if people are poking fun, we're used to coming from a place of like contempt. So I think there can sometimes be like just a snap reaction of like, if someone's poking fun, like maybe we don't give it that extra second to realize like, oh, it's actually all in good fun. They're not actually mocking this genre we love so much.
Yeah, definitely. So do you guys have a sort of a favorite sequence in The Editor?
Oh, a favorite sequence. I don't know if it's a sequence so much as just like the interesting narrative thread between Porphyry and Cal, just kind of like that admiration that just goes way over the top, like for these two guys that met one another. And it's definitely something you see, like it pops up in Gialli, where it's like these two guys meet each other and it's just like they can't get over how much admiration and respect they have for one another. And you can tell it's kind of like bordering on homoerotic. It never quite like goes for it, but just for whatever reason, that whole kind of side relationship between Porphyry and Cal just had me chuckling most of the time.
Yeah, Cal, I love the fact that Connor Sweeney in that movie, Cal is just like the worst actor I think I've ever like seen. Mm-hmm. he's just so horribly bad in that movie. Like, I love the fact that it's all ego driven with him too at certain points, where he's just like, he's going to kill Ray with a chainsaw. And then Ray's like, I know you're bad acting and there's no way you're going to do it. And I just, that made me laugh. How about for you, Monty? Is there anything that sort of sticks out for you?
For me, it's all the little pieces, like less character and more just the changes in color or the peaks in music or the different things. And I always go back to the beginning 5 minutes of that movie. I think it's just, it's just so well done. Like, most giallos that you're watching today are going to have some distress, right? You're going to older prints. You're going to see some stress in the print, and the fact that the first 5 minutes of the editor is so pristine, like you can see drops of sweat falling off of somebody. You can see like just very clearly like what's going on. That the fact that they put that so in frame is really well done, and the shifts in color I think are really great, and I really like the detectives in this movie. I think they are just playing their roles like so perfectly till the men in most films are being portrayed as well too. And I think it's just a little things. I think the Ashton Six guys really get they understand like what defines like into characteristics of Giallo. They really do like try to get as many of those little homages in the film and really make it work for them. And that's really like the thing that I've come back to. And I remember I programmed this for the International Horror and Sci-Fi Festival a few years back, and I always told everybody, I said, this is like a giallo, guys, like a giallo spoof, you gotta watch it. And it was so funny to see people leave that theater and say like, well, I don't get it. And immediately I would say like, well, you just haven't watched enough giallos yet. Like go back and watch some more giallo and you'll get it right on, perfect. But yeah, it's the little things in the movie that I think the team is doing with Ash 6 that really like brings it home for me. Has really been the staying point for me, is the fact that they get so much of the things wrong.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of sort of the scene where when Porphyry like accidentally kills his wife. That sounds like a weird thing to say out of context. But then like he's cutting off her fingers and he gets like sort of busted in that moment. And I also think there's something really interesting about the scene with the Betamax when the tape comes to life and like starts like moving and pulsating.
That's a great scene. That is a fantastic scene.
Because like part of me sort of gets like some weird Videodrome moments off of it, but then I also feel like, but I also think in some ways it's almost like a hat tip to Demons 2, and sort of that movie's obsession with like TV as being sort of this like portal as well. Which
and I love when he crosses over like kind of into that like that alternate universe within the like the viewer, the editor viewer, and he's just like he's seeing like the shade of Bella after she's been killed. That's a gorgeous sequence. That's a really well done and definitely gives like, I think that's also the Beyond vibes. Is that the one at the end where they're kind of in hell in that last shot? Yeah, I was definitely getting like that same aesthetic when he's in that alternate universe.
Yeah, no, definitely. But yeah, it's one of these movies. Like, I think, you watch it the first time and it's like if you're familiar with the movies, like you'll get a lot of the references, but I think it's one of those, like, I'm kind of excited to sort of dig into it again down the line, because then I think it'll really settle in, and it won't be just about the references. It'll be about something else. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what sort of interesting or compelling or good filmmaking really does, is that it gives you a reason to want to come back to it. So that would be sort
That's
of my thoughts on The Editor.
Yeah, that's a fantastic wrap up for that, Heather. I mean, think, for somebody who loves giallo as much as I do, I think that's exactly it. That, the fact that they are wrapping so much of it into it, and there is such great technique that's done in that movie. And and now that I'm thinking about more of the character development as well too, they really are like nailing all the little things down in terms of like how characters progress. And we Josephine in the film, her anger towards her husband and her search for stardom is really like just a nice balanced character development until like the final parts of the movie when she really does kind of take hold.
Yeah, definitely. So I think like moving on to Knife and Heart, which obviously you couldn't be any more different in terms of tone or intention or anything like that. And yet they still really work as a double feature. But I will say, because I know, Bryan, you are a big proponent of this movie and have been for quite a while. I will say that I just was not prepared for how sad this movie was going to make me.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Yeah. It's heavy. But it's just so damn beautiful. This is one of my favorite movies of the past decade, actually. It is just a gorgeously done movie that, we're talking about how like these two movies kind of what they do with the giallo tropes. And what I love about this movie so much is that it takes all of the tropes of the giallo in terms of kind of dream logic or not necessarily worrying quite as much about connecting all the dots with the narrative threads and doing really stunning things visually. Also diving into some of the like sleazier film elements. This is about, the gay porn industry, and the killer has a giant black dildo knife that he kills people with. But at the heart of this movie, it's a tragedy, and it is a beautifully done tragedy that like it dives into this world of gay pornography in the late 70s, but it portrays it in such an innocent way. Like, it's in another movie, these would be kind of sleazy people. And here they don't come off that way. Like all of the stuff that happens to them, you genuinely care about what's happening to them. Even the people who are deeply flawed, like our main character,
And
yeah, sorry, just hitting bad brain cells.
It's okay. I feel you.
She is not a good person, but at the same time, the movie gives her enough to make her sympathetic enough that to watch her tragedy unfold, kind of paralleling with the tragedy of the villain Guy. There's just a lot to kind of like, it's a very bittersweet movie. And Heather, yeah, I agree. It's very sad. And I think it's actually a movie that becomes more beautiful and sadder at the same time upon repeat viewings.
I don't know if I could do it again. I'm going to be really honest doing that. No. But go ahead, Monty.
Oh, the one thing when Bryan really, really hit it on the head with like movie is so like important and why I think it's so great for the genre is the fact that, it in the very beginning of this movie is using the giallo elements to lure you in. And as it slowly starts to lure you in, then it takes those giallo elements and really makes them artistic features to the point where, like, when you start to get into some of the dream stuff and you start to get into some of the, the nightmare things that are happening to the lead character, it really just pulls you in. And that's what I think I love most about Knife and Heart is the fact that it using the giallo elements to really get into, this commentary about people. And, when you talk about like the gay porn industry and you talk about, the fact that, this takes place right on the verge of the AIDS epidemic, in the world, and the fact that it tackles those components and, kind of understanding like, the fact that, this gay porn is going to change in the next coming years. Like you're exactly right when you say that it becomes a tragedy. These characters will eventually, in the future be, be attacked, and they won't be able to practice the love that they have for somebody else in the way that they do it without being chastised and without being called out. And the fact that this film kind of celebrates that idea of like you love who you want to love kind of thing. It's such a beautiful, you're exactly right. It's a beautiful narrative example, because what they're doing here is they're taking those elements of giallo and really telling a tragic story about love, a tragic story about relationships, and really like a tragic part of history as well too. And you're exactly right when you say that this movie is like one of the best of the decade, because I kind of feel the same. The fact that I have come back to this movie on numerous occasions and really like have thought extensively about like what they're trying to do, and how they're portraying these characters with through the lens of a giallo. And that's why giallo is so amazing to me, is the fact that it can embody and encompass so many different things. It can be satirical, but it can also be extremely serious at the same time. And I think you're exactly right when you talk about this movie being beautiful and tragic at the same time.
Yeah, I think also too, speaking to something that Bryan mentioned earlier about these characters and sort of this film community, in most sort of extensions of society, they would be seen as like deviants, or as these sort of wacky characters. Like, I feel like if you did this movie in like a John Waters style, like it just would have such a different tone to it. And I'm not saying that against John Waters, but I think he would just portray this group of actors and these filmmakers very differently than what we get here from Yann Gonzalez. And I think that for me is what really makes the movie work as well as it does, is because that when you have, sort of the subsect of society, so many of us growing up were so like conditioned to think poorly of people who are doing pornography, or especially doing gay pornography. And thankfully we've come a long way. And most of us realize that there's no shame in that. But what's really great about this is that they really are, they become these characters that you love and that you feel protective over. And even Anne, to a degree, who is a horrible person in this movie, she's a mean alcoholic. Like she's not even like a functioning alcoholic. She's just downright mean and destructive. She basically ends up sexually assaulting Lois, who is the love of her life, who, and destroys, like she's constantly destroying these parts of her life. But there's something about what's happening to her cast that's compelling her to keep moving forward. And even if she's putting them in danger by doing it, she's still motivated out of this sense of love and devotion, in this sense of loss, for what happens to Carl and to eventually to other characters, in this movie as well. And I just like the scene when they're having the picnic, to me, is just, it actually ends up being one of my favorite moments in the whole movie, because it just feels like family. It just feels so warm and inviting and safe. And it just, and not to say that it's like, it doesn't fit with the rest of the movie, but in the stark nihilism that there is in the other aspects of the movie, it just feels like a warm blanket moment where you can't help but like feel at home with these characters and want to see them, come out of this and, survive. And I really loved that about it. I just thought it was just, and any other way, like, I feel like these characters would be perceived differently if it wasn't with such a thoughtful touch from Yann Gonzalez and his fellow screenwriter, Cristiano Mangione. I think they did a really, really lovely job of giving us characters that we care about when they go. And, sometimes in giallo movies, people are just kind of there, they're just sort of nasty characters to watch them get, switchbladed into, obscurity. But here, like, the deaths, they hurt you as a viewer. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a really hard thing to pull off.
And this is where, for me, why Knife and Heart works where a lot of other giallos don't. It's using a lot of the same cinematic techniques and a lot of the same like basic narrative techniques, but they, for multiple reasons, I am able to care about these characters more. And part of it is because I think they're more deliberately written to care about them. And part of it is just the way the cinematic techniques came together. Like one of the big obstacles I have when it comes to, especially with giallos, is I usually can't get over dubbing in terms of being able to kind of immerse myself in a movie. There's always kind of that uncanny valley for me where if someone's talking and the voice coming out of their head just isn't matching with what they're, how they're acting, it's hard for me to get past that. And here they don't bother with dubbing. They just use subtitles. So, even though I have to, I'm fine with reading along with a movie if I have to, but like you can, even if I didn't know what they were saying, I would know what they're feeling. And I would be genuinely feeling either the joy or the pain or whatever it is they're going through in this movie. Unfortunately, it's a lot more pain than it is joy. But it's something that like I'm able to connect with that I can't with giallos. And the other thing, and both Monte and Heather, I think you mentioned this, and Heather especially, the respect with which they treat these characters, like Golden Mouth in any other movie would be a punchline. He would be either a complete creep or he would just be a joke. And here there is just something so innocent and sweet. And to make a kind of a portly middle-aged fluffer on a porn shoot who lives with his mom, a sweet, innocent character is such a fantastic kind of feat. Like, I don't think no one else would even try and do something like that. But I think Yann Gonzalez and Cristiano Mangione pull it off beautifully. Like, he is such a very sweet character. That scene where like they're talking to him and like, I think they asked like, what are you getting paid for this? He's like, I live with my mom.
Yeah. Yeah. Like
I just like being here.
Yeah.
Well, and it's so that, the way that they, exactly right when you say that they portray
it's just like, yes. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And the fact that, that much of, he doesn't have a lot of dialogue, right? But, the camera flashes to him and he has, what can only be described as a look of innocence on his face. Like, that goes a long way in like the portrayal of that character, the fact that you always flash as an innocent character. Like, look at the beginning of the editor and guys that are watching the woman dance at the editor, they aren't, they're lusting for the women that are on there. They look dirty. They look, like, degenerates. But in Knife and Heart, you go to that same character who is looking at a sexual act and there's innocence in his face. That goes a long ways. That's really talented filmmaking right there. The fact that they make that decision for the actor and allow him to portray that character so differently.
Yeah. One thing that was interesting, and maybe you guys know the answer better to this because you've had more time with this than I have. But I'm curious because, we see the opening where the first movie, which I'm totally blanking on the name of, the original movie that has Carl in it. And we ultimately find out that everybody who's in this movie in particular ends up dead because it ultimately portrays Guy's, own story about him having, basically falling in love with his best friend and his father discovering it and then basically killing his friend, castrating him and leaving him for dead, burning in a barn. I'm curious, like, did Anne make that movie because she had some sort of knowledge of that story and that set, like, was it just sort of fortuitous that those things aligned? It's just so interesting to me that this movie, like that first movie exists. But ultimately it's almost like a beat for beat, like cinematic representation of what this, the killer ends up, going through and becomes his motivation for embarking on this journey in the first place. I'm just curious. It's almost like a chicken and the egg kind of scenario. And I'm curious about your theories on that because I don't know that I have the answers.
I have always kind of read that as just like going with the flow of like, man, that's a big coincidence, but I think it was just a coincidence. Like, I don't think she went in with any knowledge of that story beforehand. I think it kind of gets into like they dip into the supernatural a little bit, like when she talks to the guy who has like the bird features, because I think they're playing with some of those giallo tropes there, where it's like they toe that line between realism and supernatural, and I think that's just kind of where they're going with that whole narrative, is that just by some kind of twist of fate, she happened to make this movie that just lined up perfectly with Guy's life story and just set these events into motion. And I think in a way that kind of, ties thematically with, Monte, you had mentioned that this takes place in the late 70s, right before the AIDS crisis hit. And I just think it's kind of like, kind of foreshadowing that, what we know now, with hindsight, kind of that that oncoming freight train that is AIDS is coming. And they don't know it, but like fate is going to take a very bad turn come the early 80s, and things are going to take a very tragic and deadly turn. And I think that kind of mirrors like that kind of carefree attitude that just winds up happening to cause everybody's demise. It's not that they did anything wrong, but it wound up leading to some very bad stuff happening.
Yeah, and like Heather, I've thought about that as well too. Like, why is this coincidence between the the killer and Anne so deliberate? But it's so funny because I always go back and say like, well, through the framing of a giallo, I just kind of accept it. I kind of accept that that coincidence can happen, and that the shifts in narrative are almost purposefully there, just to get you from point A to point B to point C. In any other movie, I definitely have issue with it, but because it's framed the lens of a giallo, I almost just kind of accept it and just like go along with it. But Bryan, you make a great example about, talking about like this oncoming, tragic story that's coming along the line. And when the film takes the opportunity to kind of give you, this backstory of Guy's lifestyle and, how he ended up to where he is today, it really is like, this moment for you to, find some kind of empathy with his character as well too, which is oftentimes something that they don't do in giallo film. So, but yeah, I think, for me, it's like the fact that it's framed within the lens of a giallo. I really just kind of just go and accept anything that would happen, throughout the course of the film, which is fun to say, considering, that I don't have that kind of leniency for others where, if I was writing a review about something, I would obviously say, oh, it doesn't make any sense that, Anne's movie matches up with the life of the killer, like, right, it doesn't work. But again, like with the giallo's influence on how they are crafted, it almost like I just almost like just look beyond it and just be like, okay, yeah, that's going to happen because this is a giallo.
Yeah. And I think the final moments of this movie too are really powerful as well, because it all sort of boils down to this big scene in the movie theater. And it's interesting to me because Guy, for when you hear his backstory, and it is tragic. Like, I mean, obviously he's a killer and he's a bad person. But there is this tragedy that sets him on this course, and it's in basically his story begins because of intolerance and unacceptance and violence and loss. And so there's a part of me that, feels really bad for him. But I think that scene in the end, when he's sort of discovered by this community sitting in the theater watching the movie, and they realize that he is this man who has brought so much fear into their community, which otherwise seems very tight knit. Everybody seems to be looking out for each other. And they basically just destroy him. To me, one is so outside of the realm of what we normally see in giallo movies. Like they're rarely that sort of satisfying in that fashion. Like usually it's a policeman comes in and shoots the killer, or there's some sort of police interference in some fashion. But I really love that the way that it's at the end of this movie that this community gets to reclaim their sovereignty and their sanctity and their sense of community by taking down Guy and basically, rip. I don't want to say rip into parts because that sounds sort of zombie-esque, but they basically start stabbing him and beating him up and things like that. And there's just something really great about that. I mean, I kind of feel weird saying that, but I think
no, Heather,
just,
absolutely. I don't feel weird about that. That's actually a point that came up. I was lucky enough last year, I believe it was, to interview Kay Lynch, the founder of Salem Horror Fest, about Knife and Heart. And they pointed out that there's definitely the tragic element because Guy is a tragic figure. His story is very, very sad, but there's definitely also Kay. They refer to when the young men in the movie theater kind of come together to take Guy down as kind of this Congress of queers, and they're banding together and taking care of this issue because they know only they can take care of it. And that's kind of a through line that's also been present throughout the whole movie, because you keep coming back to the cops who don't really give a crap. They say like, well, maybe don't go out alone, or, just don't go out after night if that's when these are happening. Like the cops clearly don't care. These are a group of people that are dismissed. And so, that ending reflects that, help isn't going to come from outside. They need to do it themselves. So that it is, while it's sad, there's also something very kind of empowering about it.
Yeah, because I mean, I was going to say really quick, just to speak to that. It's just that we've realized at this point, when Anne Kaiser has to keep going back to the police don't care what's really going on. Like, obviously, they want to catch a killer, but they're not really invested in it because it's not affecting the community at large. It's affecting a very specific part of that community, which, again, even though it's set in 1979, speaks volumes for where we're at today. So that to me really stood out. Sorry, Monte, I didn't mean to jump right on.
Oh, no, I was just going to tack Brian's conversation about that as well, too. Where, like, I remember sitting in a room here Phoenix, and we'll just screen this movie, and we had like this discussion with the audience, and it was really interesting to hear kind of the emotional tone that the audience had, the characters in the film, but specifically like in terms of metaphor, like maybe a metaphor of like what Guy represents for the future, because we're moving up to the late 70s and the early 80s, and the AIDS crisis taking over. That Guy may be the representation of above future, futures for who were shortened because of it. And the fact that maybe Guy's representation as a killer is more or less a metaphor for what ends up happening in the future and the tragic demise of many gay men because of AIDS. And also maybe the stigmatization of AIDS, as well too, when you have the cops who don't care about any of it, there was a large portion of America that, almost,
didn't care.
Demonized, gay men for what they were doing. And it's unfair and unjust. And I think there's a lot of that exists within that movie as well too. Maybe like a metaphor for social commentary as to, happening in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing I want to mention before we sort of wrap this up is obviously having the score, the music by M83 in this movie also.
So good. Like
as somebody who loves M83, again, I don't know why I didn't watch this movie sooner. Cause like, what is wrong with me? What am I really doing with my life? Like that I couldn't sit down and watch this for 90 something minutes. But like, my God, the music in this movie is so freaking good. Like, I mean, maybe that added to my emotions because I get it's like certain music makes me kind of emotional. And there's a lot of M83 that makes me emotional. So a lot of Postal Service. So it's like when I was listening to this, maybe it's just like that M83 connection. And I was just like, I was in my feelings the entire time. And I don't even care because it works. It works so well. And I really loved their contributions to this movie. It's so great. And it's such a huge like coup for Gonzalez to be able to bring them into this, because I don't think they were making music at the time that this movie had come along a few years ago, if I'm not mistaken.
And they could not have hit the tone more perfectly for like what this movie is doing, kind of hitting that very bittersweet, but also very innocent feel. Like they just knock it out of the park. It's so good. But while also mixing in, I'm not sure, because I think they worked in a couple of songs that weren't M83, but the opening song, Thrash Me, I believe it's called, is just like, it's a song that's absolutely coming out swinging. And it also, like, you know, we didn't touch on this too much, but like on top of this being a very beautiful and tragic movie, in a lot of ways, it's also a very sexy movie. Like it's, just like it's not like, it's not sleazy in a way that a lot of giallos are, while it very well could have gone down that road, especially given the content. But like, I don't know, I felt like it was, you know, it was very kind of like earnestly sexy, and it wasn't like gross sexy the way some giallos can be. And I think that opening song kind of sets that tone for what that movie is going to be that way.
Yeah, I also appreciated in the opening when Carl's in the club that the drummer had the bird head on, which felt very much like out of like Stage Fright.
Nice. Yeah.
Yeah. I was like, I see what we're doing here. But again, very subtle. It's one of those little nods for those of us who might recognize that sort of visual little breadcrumb there. So I was just like, yes, okay, I get it. But yeah, that opening sequence is just, I think I don't know that I took a breath for like basically until we cut away from that scene. And I was like, okay, you know, and it just kept delivering from there. So I was really glad to have had that, I don't want to say excuse to watch this, but like a really good reason to finally take the time to sit down and really, really watch this movie.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if I'm not mistaken, Yann Gonzalez is a musician as well too, right? So it would make sense that, you know, he would pay such close attention to the thematic themes in the film as well too. You know, M83 makes everything. Like I remember watching Oblivion, Tom Cruise movie, and like being like, "Wow, that movie's so great." And in hindsight, I remember thinking, "Oh, just the music that made it great." And you know, being kind of torn by it. But M83, you know, you're exactly right, does such a great job with this, and you know, they really do add a sensitivity to the tone of the film that I think really makes it work.
Absolutely. Well, I think that's probably a pretty good stopping point for this. Is there anything else you guys would like to add about the movies that we've talked about tonight? I feel like we've really dove in here, and it's been a really fun conversation, at least from my perspective.
You know, I think in general, you know, if you're you know, for people that are watching movies, if this is your first, like, you know, foray into giallo films, there's a lot of great, you know, exploration that can be done after this. And, you know, maybe you're not going to be a giallo expert after you know, delve into the movies that may influence these films that we talked about tonight. But, you know, I do think giallo film and the genre especially is really, really important in understanding like the progression of like film history and, you know, where film history goes and how like giallos influence slasher. I don't think you get to these slash films having the influence of the giallo, and the fact that the giallo is highly influenced by Hitchcock and how Hitchcock, you know, framed and made these films, you know, that were and so suspenseful. The giallo is all trying to do that. And, you know, in terms of like, you know, especially at Halloween, they might not be the most frightening films, but, you know, they do service as a foundation for horror moving forward. And, you know, really the influence of the 70s, you know, with Texas Chainsaw and Black Christmas, and then even later, you know, Friday the 13th, and, you know, all these other films that, you know, would, you know, find in life because of what the giallo was doing. And I explore the giallo. Find maybe those 3 or 4 favorite highlight films and give them a watch, because I think they are important for film fans, especially today, to explore.
Definitely. Anything else you want to talk about, Bryan, or you?
No, I would just throw out there again, if you're not someone who has maybe not seen Knife and Heart because you don't get as into the giallo subgenre, I would definitely recommend giving that one a try. Just because, like I said, as someone who, I get something out of giallos. I just don't think I connect with them the way that other folks might. But Knife and Heart does something with it that turns it into something that for me is really, really special. So, if you have avoided it up until now, I would implore you to give it a try, because it's just a beautiful movie.
Absolutely. And if you happen to subscribe to Shudder, and if you aren't, I don't know what you're doing with your life if you're listening to this show and you're not subscribing to Shudder, just turn us off right now and go subscribe and go dive into like their insane library of amazing movies out there. But I believe Knife and Heart is streaming exclusively through Shudder. And that alone, it's worth getting Shudder for at least a month so you can dive into that and some other great movies there. But yeah, I'm so glad I finally got a chance to see this, and I know it's something I'll be watching more in the future as well. Although I realized when I was watching it the other night, my living room faces out to the courtyard of my building. And you can see my TV like pretty prominently if you're just standing anywhere in the courtyard. And I realized I had like my curtains open and stuff. And I was like, boy, I bet my neighbors, if they're walking by, are like, what's going on up there? Between watching The Editor and this back to back, it was there was a whole lot going on my TV that night. So I'm sure my
so fun somebody walk by, just on a night walk with their dog and look into your front window and be like, I believe that's a mass killer with a knife.
Yes. Which, by the way, it's funny because like there's certain things where I'm like, okay, it's an interesting thing, but God, that was terrifying. And I was just like, oh boy, like I knew nothing good was gonna come of that moment before the knife came out. And then the knife comes out and I was like, well, this got even worse. Like, because there's already that sense of dread, and then you're like, oh, Jesus Christ. Okay, never mind. Yeah.
You also got to love that Hitchcockian kind of take they do, where like now that it's a knife, later on with Theory, like yes. That's like textbook suspense in a very unique situation.
By the way, I love you didn't take French in high school, did you?
I did not. No.
I like how you called him Theory. It's Thierry.
That's what I said.
You said Theory.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah, there's very few instances of that, because I watched like 2 movies that have done a lot of like it's all French dialogue, and I was like, this is why I took French in junior high and high school for these moments, because I watched this and then I watched Mandibles a couple days prior, and I was like, yes, there we go. Where I can actually don't even need the subtitles sometimes because it actually makes sense in my head. I was like, this is what I was building towards. But yeah, I just thought that was cute, Theory.
So yes, obviously my French isn't great. So the scene with Thierry, did I say it right that time? Thierry, yeah. That is like just textbook Hitchcockian suspense.
Oh
with a dildo knife.
Yeah, it's the ticking bomb is a dildo knife. that's the bomb theory in somebody's mouth, and you're like, oh no.
Maybe it was just me, but like, was anybody else surprised that the guy with the mask and the messy hair was like constantly hitting guys? Like, I don't know. Like maybe I just find him like in the room full of all the guys that were in there, he'd probably be like pick number 50 on my list.
I don't know. I think there was something kind of
has something to do with it.
And just like he had like a swagger about him. Like I think he had like a mysterious brooding confidence that like, I don't know, like, and again, if we're kind of going in that giallo kind of half dreamy logic, then it's kind of one of those things where like I was certainly willing to go with it.
Oh, Bryan, I just want to say I have burning swagger. I just want somebody to say that to me now.
It's life goals right there.
It's life goals, totally.
Excellent. Well, guys, thank you so much for doing this. For those of you listening at home, you can stream Knife and Heart on Shudder. If you don't own the editor, you can also stream that over on, I believe that's on Tubi TV, which is a wealth of horror. Like, you can spend like 10 hours just scrolling through their entire horror collection over there as well. And I really appreciate you guys taking the time to do this. And for those of you who have been supporting Corpse Club for all these years, we do appreciate your support and listening along to us over the years. And for those of you who are new to Corpse Club, you can find out more about us over at corpseclub.com. And for all of your daily news and reviews and interviews and fun stuff like that, you can check us out over at dailydead.com. We're going to be doing Gialloween coverage basically up and through Halloween. So you've got a few weeks to play catch up with everything. And a huge thank you to our engineer, Bryan, for, doing the Dark Lord's work on these episodes. And until next time, everybody, stay scary.